Hi everyone, my name is Jill McClemens, and today I will be taking you on an informative journey about the history of LGBTQ pride events. So, I'll begin with the question, what is the first thing that you think of when you hear someone talk about LGBTQ pride? Many people think of a massive group of party people parading around the city once a year, decorated with literal sunshine and rainbows all over the place. You might even recognize the rainbow flag as a commonplace emblem for the LGBTQ community nowadays. But, much like the phrase suggests, the history of these celebratory events were not rooted in sunshine and rainbows. In fact, the whole concept of pride was once not a lavish celebration, but a fight, an homage, and a journey rooted in protest for basic civil rights among the LGBT community. It took many decades of pride events to evolve into the month-long party that they are today. A party that was once only a hope and a dream of LGBT Americans in the 1960s. This era is where we will begin our journey through a brief history of LGBT pride events. The speech is going to highlight the brutal history of LGBT identifying Americans, and it's important to discuss those things because it's very easy for history to repeat itself and fall backwards. We'll be analyzing first the cornerstone events that guided the LGBT community through its civil rights advocacy, and then the traditions that grew from these cornerstone events that we now see in our modern day pride events. The following information is pulled from various sources such as the National Park Service, the Library of Congress, the Harvey Milk Association, the ACLU, the Daily Bruin, and of course the official West Hollywood Pride website. This speech will inform you of the brutal, big emphasis on that word, and important history of LGBTQ civil rights liberation movement, and discuss the origins of how these events show themselves in the traditions that are displayed in the modern day Pride event. But before we get into our analysis of LGBT pride traditions, let's just take a look at some of the most influential events in LGBT history and how those events contributed to the growth of the LGBT community liberation. So, the Stonewall Uprising, also known as the Stonewall Riots, is largely considered to be the foundation of LGBT civil rights. At the time, it was not uncommon for police raids to be carried out on bars that served openly LGBT-identifying customers, because it was actually illegal to serve alcohol to anyone who openly identified on the LGBT spectrum. On June 28, 1969, a raid of the Stonewall Inn propelled LGBT civil rights advocacy, where the community finally had enough of the violence and attacks and chose to protest. As noted in the Library of Congress's historical files, the events of the Stonewall Uprising began in the mid-hour of 1 a.m. Sunday, June 28, 1969. An undercover search warrant was set to investigate the Stonewall Inn for the illegal sale of alcohol to queer-identifying people. This raid went on for hours into the morning. Many people were locked inside, brutally mistreated by police. Bargoers in attendance that night who did not outwardly conform to the New York Penal Code of 1969 were more susceptible to police identification and therefore victims of police brutality. Since the code stated that individuals they could not wear any more than 3 articles of clothing that matched their gender assigned at birth, lesbians, drag queens, queer youth, transgender, and gender non-conforming people were all high-risk targets for police brutality and arrest. Reportedly, since they were easier to identify, and therefore easier to justify the arrest. Employers of the bar were also vulnerable to identification. The intentions behind the raid were deeply coded in prejudice against outwardly queer identifying people and became the straw that broke the camel's back of attacks of the LGBT community. Later we will discuss how the aftermath of this event connects to our first modern day, how it connects to our modern day Pride Day celebration. Our next noteworthy topic we will discuss is the influence of Harvey Milk, and more importantly, his assassination. Harvey Milk was San Francisco's first openly gay city-county supervisor in 1978. His legacy is often credited to breaking the glass ceiling for openly gay-identifying politicians and forging a true representation of LGBT individuals in the state and local governments, something that was incredibly rare at the time. The following information comes from the official biography of Harvey Milk. The Milk's political career not only gave LGBT-identifying people a sense of representation in government, but he was a political figure with a position of power to actually be able to stop anti-LGBT policies from becoming law. The most noteworthy proposition Milk helped to prevent was Prop 6, which could allow openly gay-identifying teachers in state and public schools to be fired. Milk also demonstrated many acts of political courage by speaking out against, quote, state and national interests of LGBTQ community, women, racial and ethnic minorities, and other marginalized communities, end quote, and that is from the Harvey Milk Foundation. Harvey Milk was assassinated by Dan White on November 27th, 1978. This tragedy felt like yet another political attack on the LGBT Americans and ignited many to band together in protest. The symbolism and messages of his assassination were highlighted in the 1979 March on Washington, where many LGBT-identifying individuals protested in memory of Milk and what he advocated for. More on that as we connect it to Pride parades. Now, our final piece of queer history involves the groundbreaking case of Obergefell versus Hodges in the 2015 Marriage Equality Act. Fast forwarding nearly 30 years after Milk's assassination, state issues marriage license for queer-identifying couples have been recognized as a legitimate form of marriage in some states, but it took another 10 years for the national recognition of queer marriage licenses from state to state. This historic and heartbreaking case of Obergefell versus Hodges eventually led to the national recognition of gay marriage. The following information is pulled from the archives of the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. The case of Obergefell versus Hodges involved two men, James Obergefell and John Arthur James, who were legally married in the state of Maryland. Unfortunately, John Arthur James passed away in Ohio in the year 2013. The state of Ohio refused to recognize their marriage as legitimate on Arthur James' death certificate because, according to the state of Ohio, it did not recognize their marriage to be legally binding. According to the ACLU of Ohio, quote, the plaintiff sought a declaration for the court that Ohio's practice of denying recognition of marriage lawfully performed in other states on death certificates is unconstitutional and requested an injunction to stop this practice, end quote, from the ACLU of Ohio. The nuances of this case were so finite that it was taken all the way to the Supreme Court, where, quote, the court ordered that each party brief one of two issues that pertain to its respective case. One, whether the 14th Amendment required a state license of marriage between two people of the same sex, and two, whether the 14th Amendment required a state to recognize marriage between two people of the same sex when their marriage was lawfully licensed and performed out of state, end quote, from the ACLU of Ohio. This led to the official amending of the 14th Amendment, where it requires all states to legally recognize gay marriage licenses from within the United States as legitimate. More on that in just a moment, on how that is an influence in our modern day pride traditions. So, now that we have a taste of the tragic backstories that influence LGBT history, where do the traditions of pride celebrations actually come from? Meaning, where are all the sunshine and rainbows? Well, now let's take a look at the development of the traditions of Pride Day, Pride Week, Pride Marches, Pride Month, and of course, what we now refer to as the modern day Pride event. So, remember how we said that the events of Stonewall were largely considered to be the foundation of LGBTQ liberation? Well, 1 year following the Stonewall riots, local LGBT community of New York joined together to celebrate the community as the first official Pride Day on June 28th in memory of the Stonewall events. This day was named the Christopher Street Liberation Day in reference to a street in which Stonewall resided. Christmas Street Liberation Day was just one piece of a whole week rooted in celebrating and advocating for LGBTQ stories and history in the community, as they felt it was crucial for these stories to live on and be retold. The week in reference is the week of June 22nd through 28th in 1970, which is where we get the tradition of Pride Week, usually happening within a latter week of June. On the contrary to modern Pride Day events, on the contrary to modern Pride Days, Christmas Street Liberation Day wasn't necessarily filled with partying and concerts, but a protest known as the Annual Reminder Day pickets. As the Library of Congress notes, picketers walked up and down Christopher Street advocating for LGBT civil rights to be taken more seriously and validated. The organizers intended Christopher Street Liberation Day to be the annual tradition held in the last week of June each year as a reminder of the attacks that occurred in the LGBT community. Thus, the tradition of gay pride being held in June is an homage to the original police raid of Stonewall Inn in 1969. So, as we know, LGBTQ pride is deeply rooted in protest and advocacy for civil rights and equality, and what better way to express that than the American tradition of marching down the main street of your local town. This is exactly the case for the first March on Washington in 1979, which gave way to the tradition of pride parades. So, the following information was provided by the National Park Service Archives. You can see a few protesters marching in front of the White House and President's Park. Following the assassination of Harvey Milk, members of the LGBTQ community gathered from all over the nation to march collectively down the streets of Washington, D.C. in 1979 to protest Harvey Milk's assassination. At the time, this was one of the largest gatherings of LGBT identifying people, and it was important to educate the nation on why the assassination of Harvey Milk was an attack on the community. Today, the homages of these marches take the form of the modern-day Pride Parade, much more celebratory, right? Which is usually held on the final day of a Pride weekend celebration. Modern-day Pride parades usually involve special guests, musical artists, nonprofit and for-profit organizations that are sponsors or allies of the community, and yes, of course, the occasional protest. All that information can be found on the 1979 March in Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights on the National Park Service website. Lastly, we will take a look at where our annual Pride Month comes from and how the traditions we've discussed so far encompass a modern-day Pride event celebration. The groundbreaking case of Obergefell versus Hodges led June to becoming nationally recognized as Pride Month in the United States. It is pure coincidence that Pride Day from the 1969 Stonewall Uprising and Pride Month from Obergefell versus Hodges both fell in the month of June, but that makes it all the more intentional for June to be National Pride Month. Pride events and celebrations as we see them today have been around for way longer than the changing of the 14th Amendment. Many big cities, particularly those with large LGBTQ communities, hold annual Pride events or celebrations in various weekends, usually between the months of May and August. Most commonly, they are held in June, since June is National Pride Month. Features of modern-day Pride events involve musical performances by artists that identify as LGBTQ or allies and advocates of the community. Usually street fairs and pop-up events allow LGBTQ businesses and organizations to connect with people in the community, much like how the Stonewall riots, all the aftermath after that, everybody wanted to meet and hear how the stories and advocacy and all that. And then while Pride music festivals usually involve a ticket nowadays for entry, most Pride parades are free to attend. And all this information can be taken from the West Hollywood Pride official website. So we've had a pretty involved but brief big picture overview of LGBT history, and now you can continue the tradition of passing on the stories on and never forgetting the decades-long fight it took to build the progress that we have for our LGBT community. The term pride carries its full meaning in the community, and as we can see from this brief history, far too many influences have ended in tragedy, violence, and even death. That one could even say martyrs of the LGBT community. The people affected were just common people looking to live out their lives just like anyone else in America. So to take pride in one's queer identity is to validate and uplift themselves and others who identify all the same. Much like the saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, the way LGBT communities are treated now was merely a dream and a hope for a future with basic civil rights back in the 1960s. These are the dreams and hopes that we wish to continue by paying homage to our past, progress to the future, and celebration through our joyous sunshine and rainbows of the modern-day LGBT event. So we broke down all these major events that gave way to our traditions of our modern-day Pride events. And it's important to remember this brutal history so that you can see how it is transformed and formed into our LGBT Pride traditions from a modern-day Pride event. So with that, please remember and honor these traditions, as it is very easy for history to repeat itself and fall backwards. So best thing to do, keep the stories going, keep retelling these stories, and let's keep the progress moving straight forward. Thank you.